All right. Well, greetings. Good morning. It is fruit tree pruning time of year again. So, time to run our class. We do every year, and always remember that these things post online. We have a couple of years worth probably online now, and if this one goes really well, we might post it too. It could happen. We try not to keep too many duplicates up on our YouTube. For those who don't know me, I'm Darren Morgan, nursery manager here. I've been doing this for 35 years. I grew up farming, so I had a little fruit tree pruning experience even before I started doing this. Although, to be honest, we didn't necessarily do it technically correctly on the farm. No surprises there. So today's class is focused on fruit tree pruning. We're talking a little bit about some of the theories of making cuts, plant structure, and then also selecting and making some tree decisions. Obviously, since we're not set up for a live on-tree demonstration, which takes hours and hours and hours, we're going to be got some branch samples to show, and we'll be looking at pictures online. Pictures in this presentation come from our Pruning Made Easy book, Story Publishing, Lewis Hill, excellent pruning book. There's other pruning guides out there if you like, but we like that one a lot because it's very, very clear. Okay, so fruit tree pruning. Why? Why do we prune fruit trees? They're growing. Why do we want to change them from growing? Well, there's a few things we want to accomplish in the course of pruning a fruit tree. First is noticing and reducing disease and pest issues. Second thing is primarily about size control. So you want to keep in mind that a fruit tree, even a grafted dwarf or semi-dwarf fruit tree, tends to get kind of tall. And you don't necessarily want to be climbing 18 feet a ladder to manage or harvest a tree. So control of overall size and presentation of the tree is relevant to being successful in the orchard. Can you do without it? Yes. But it's definitely beneficial for the average homeowner in particular. I remember working cherries as a kid in 30-foot cherry trees. Yeah, so this is why we do this. You don't have to do that. Proper pruning can significantly improve your fruit productivity, the amount of actual successful fruit yielded on the tree, and the quality of fruit. A tree that's trying to ripen too much fruit does not have good quality fruit. So you are trying to restrict that somewhat. And particularly as trees age, it is very important to maintain healthy, adequate vigor. So trees do reduce in their growth spurts as they get older, and we are going to prune to rejuvenate some of that. There is a spare chair there if you want to grab one. So those are all the reasons we are trying to do the fruit tree pruning. So when do we prune? Well, we prune now for the most part, for most trees, for most circumstances. This may not be the only pruning you do on a fruit tree in the year. There's some secondary pruning that can be very beneficial for specific reasons. But
We've had one good freeze last night.
in the dormant season,
So far.
when basically there's no leaves on the tree, late enough in the season that the sap is not rising now, but is getting ready to rise. And with all the leaves off the tree, you can really see the bud development and make good decisions about what's happening out there. This means that trees really do have to be dormant. And in Western Oregon, that's sometimes a bit of a chancy thing, to be honest. I mean, you look at Thanksgiving, and many trees are not dormant yet. In fact, pear trees are often still in full leaf in late November. I'm often raking my pear tree leaves between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So usually no earlier than early December, after we've had a couple of significant freeze frost events to get them dormant. The other end of the season is bud break. Once the buds really start swelling and popping the sheaths over the flower buds, you're likely to increase the amount of damage that you're doing to those trees. It's also can be very, very difficult to actually make as good a decisions on the cuts because there's so much starting to get in the way. So pruning is now. We'll talk a little bit more about conditions in a second here. There's often some other pruning that may need to go on, and part of this is because of different tree responses to pruning at different times of year. Other things are just about the seasonality of development. So Primary pruning for structural elements, disease control, you definitely want to be doing this dormant. You might want to do an additional thinning prune after flower during the fruit development stages. For most fruit trees, this is about June. We focus heavily on thinning the large single-fruited trees, plums, peaches, apricots, apples, pears. Too much production in them is a problem. On the other hand, too much production in cherries really isn't per se a thing if you're doing a reasonable pruning in the first place. You're not trying to separate them as much. Some rules of thumb about fruit thinning. Remember that there's almost always a fruit drop during the first real hot snap, which is often later than you want to do your thinning. So a July drop is really common on a lot of fruit trees. So don't over thin. Some good rules of thumb on this material is like on apples and pears, the larger fruited stuff, try to thin down to single fruits per cluster. Look at apples, and sometimes there's 3 or 5 on a spur. That's too many. They're going to bounce into each other. They're going to cause you problems. Try to thin down to singles. Maybe keep a double if they're well spaced, but get that fruit production down per spur. And then try to go for something around 6 inches or so, a flat hand span or so between fruiting spurs. Don't let them all cluster together. Other responses matter, particularly trees that tend to have a tendency to really aggressively respond to winter pruning with lots and lots of vegetative growth. This includes pears and plums in particular. It can be really beneficial to back off some of your winter pruning and do more of the interior thinning and opening out in fruit production season, again, June to July. Yes, you have to be more careful. The sap is flowing through the branches. It's easier to damage the tree. You've got crops on the tree. You have to be more gentle. But doing that pruning in June, July makes a big difference in tree response. So when you're pruning the dormant season, the plant is moving into a vegetative growth state. Its buds are already set, and that energy is stored in those flower and fruit buds, right? So when the sap rises, they'll develop out. But as soon as those flowers have finished opening out on stored energy, the plant rapidly transitions to pushing new vegetative growth out. If you've done a substantial amount of branch removal during that dormant season, it's trying to replace all that wood as fast as it can to support all these flower buds it set the year before on that growth. On the other hand, if you prune after the fruit has set and begun to ripen, the tree hormone balance changes. And it's actually focused heavily on developing that fruit and on then developing the next series of flower buds after the fruit finishes, and less on putting out lots of leaf and shoot growth. You get less active fill-in growth from a summer pruning. Does that mean you should summer prune? Some summer pruning is good, particularly trees that are having some problems with fill-in growth. Pruning exclusively in the summer is difficult because you're dropping big branches right through all your crops. It's really hard to do safely without damaging the tree or restricting your crops. Combinations of pruning are just fine. Doing both is just fine. Sucker removal on trees that tend to sucker, pears in particular, plums in particular, can be done also in the summer, and that does reduce the amount of resucker growth that's happening. Conditions matter. Can you prune in the rain? Yes, but it's not only unpleasant for you, really wet weather can help spread diseases. So pruning into substantially wet weather can give you an increased risk of disease problems. I prefer to prune when it's not raining, but this is Western Oregon. You can find a day in January that's above freezing and not raining. Not happening very often. So you do need to kind of attenuate that. Don't prune into a downpour unless you're really strapped for time. Light, misty, or sporadic rain is not really a problem. Work around it as best you can. Can you prune in freezing weather? Air temperature should be above freezing when you are pruning. That kind of limits a lot of today. Beautiful day other than that. If you are pruning material during freezing air conditions, you are risking damaging the edges of your cuts. as well as additional damage from the brittleness in the branches you're putting your ladder up against, things like that. So avoid pruning during freezing weather. You can prune on a day that was freezing at dawn and is warming up during the day. Do it in the afternoon, just fine. That's really not an issue. But we don't get a lot of it. But if our temperatures are getting down into the teens or lower, and if that's the forecast within the next couple of days after pruning, back off the pruning a little bit. Those newly cut tissues can be damaged by really severe cold. I'm being probably exceptionally cautious when I say teens. This is really a problem like in the Midwest, where they're talking single digit temperatures, 0 degree temperatures that they have to watch more. But theoretically, anything significantly below 20 could have some risk of damaging the fresh cuts. So if they've got 48 hours after cut, you're pretty much past that. Okay. So those are the cautions on timing. Tools. What do you need to get the job done? Pruners. Lots of good pruners out there. And you can see some samples on the table over there. I mean, Felcos are wonderful pruners if you need this high quality pruner. I'm a big fan of them. I got a pair at home, but they're very expensive. They're really the top of the line pruner out there. You're not going to be doing your fruit trees a lot of work with hand pruners once they're older than about 3 or 4 years old. Some, but not much. Most of your pruning is going to be done with bigger materials. There are plenty of good pruners that aren't as expensive as Felcos. I've got a Coronas I'm using around here. We've got some Zenports over there on the table. Good quality pruners, yes. Do you need to spend top dollars? Not unless you're doing a ton of trees and maybe a ton of other things and you use your pruners as much as I do. You'll want Felcos. If you're doing the occasional seasonal pruning on a handful of shrubs and trees, you really don't need to spend that kind of money. So what makes Felcos so exceptional? Well, they're exceptionally well made in the first place. Every part of that pruner can be replaced if something goes wrong. You can buy replacement parts and just swap out the part you need. It may take you a week or two to get them shipped in, but they're there. That is really not true for any other major pruner on the marketplace. They don't tend to drift out of adjustment very readily, and they're very adjustable to refine. So it makes them a very solid pruner. Lopper is a bigger pruner. So the lopper. The vast majority of your fruit tree pruning will be done with things like this or saws as the trees get older, because you really shouldn't be doing anything very big with a hand pruner or you'll end up with serious hand issues. So when you're looking at branch materials, little branches like this, excellent to take off with a hand pruner. Does very fine. When you get down to this, we're talking about an inch there of diameter. Really think about whether you want to try to do that with a hand pruner. That's actually a lot of stress on your hand. That's usually up into lopper territory. And then once we start getting that 1.5, 1 3/4, you're starting to move into saw territory. Saws, in the vast majority of cases, you do not need a massive saw for a fruit tree. Now, really, really ancient orchards, sometimes that gets to be a little more of a case. But something with 7 inches of blade is plenty of blade for small branch removal. And you get up to 10 or 12 inches and you've got everything you will realistically need. Keep in mind that saw, you need to have enough room for action. In other words, if you're taking a 6-inch branch, you're not going to take that with a 7-inch saw. You need more movement room than that. Pull cut and push cut saws, everybody has their favorites. Usually there's some curvilinear or some straight fixed blades. And again, there's a variety of brands. Both Corona and Felco are well regarded. Wolfgarten, if you want something a little different, one of the European brands, very solid. You can get saws mounted on poles. So you've got the reach. This can dramatically reduce the amount of up and down ladder work you do and the risk to life and limb of going up and down trees. They also, a lot of those pole saws also have a pruner attachment that you can put on. It's a lanyard based pull. The caution to that is that's really, really hard on your neck, back, and shoulders. I mean, I'm in pretty good shape. I do this a lot, and doing a full grown, very mature apple tree, 3 hours of that kind of work, that's about all I can do without taking a serious break. It's not something you're just going to go from tree to tree to tree really fast. They're heavy and you're lifting them at an odd angle. Do wear gloves Not only is it cold, but it protects your hands both from scraping on bark spurs and cut branches, or also from the blades of the implements themselves. In most cases, you will need to do at least a little bit of ladder work. Three-point ladders are very successful in any terrain you can use them in. So you've got the two branches of the ladder you walk up the steps on. You've got a third kick-out leg that gives you support structure. Four-point painter's ladders can work, but it's really hard to get them into the tree branches enough to get in close a lot of the time. And you really shouldn't be putting extension ladders up against the tree branches and climbing up them. It's really not safe nor good for the tree. Rain gear, because it's likely to be cold, and heavy jacket, because it's likely to be cold and wet. Trees in question, of course. Sanitizers. Okay. There's levels to this. And if you've got really healthy trees and you're doing maintenance pruning, you've never had any real disease problems on them, you might consider foregoing the sanitizers. But there's a batch of diseases, particularly bacterial diseases, that can spread from tree to tree on your pruners. We generally recommend that at least every time you swap trees, you take a moment and clean up all of your pruning implements to reduce that risk. You can use rubbing alcohol, or you can use a 1 part bleach and 9 parts water solution to sterilize them. Just get them cleaning of all those biological organisms which trap in the sap and then get moved to the next tree. Bacterial diseases are no joke. They're kind of hard to get rid of. And that's the biggest thing we worry about in terms of sanitation. Courage. You're gonna have to get used to whacking on some of this stuff. You have to remove a fair amount of material to do this successfully, and it looks very much like a butcher job when you're done, and it's a good thing. You are controlling and directing the tree's behavior, and it's not a bad thing. You can always underdo and learn as you go. Most people do underdo when they first get started, and then develop their tolerance for heavier pruning through experience. Book I mentioned at the outset, Pruning Made Easy. Excellent book. We use this for training our staff. It's one of our standard reference books here at the nursery, and it's our top selling book. It's one of the top 75 garden books of all time. Diagrams you see in the slideshow here are from this book. We do have it available for sale, of course. There are other good pruning books out there. What I like about this one is heavily focused on fruit trees, but it also covers small fruits, a good range of ornamentals, vines, specialty training like espalier and cordon training, and with nice little line drawing illustrations that are easy to see and follow, as well as a decent explanation. So very good. Question in the chat from the folks following along online. Can you use electric saws and chainsaws? Yes, you absolutely can. They do a bit more trauma to the branch than a hand saw or a hand pruner, but they are a lot faster and a lot easier on the body to use, and that's not at all uncommon. So that's certainly an option, especially if you're doing a batch of trees. You might definitely resort to that. I know my dad prunes his fruit trees with his chainsaw primarily, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But you are doing some more structural damage to the branches. You need to be a little more cautious about placing your cuts in particular. We'll talk a little bit more about making cuts here shortly. The other thing about chainsaws and other mechanical saws, they're harder to clean and sterilize. So the risk of spreading disease is perhaps a little higher between the trauma on the tissues plus the inability to get them really clean. Okay, when we're talking about tree pruning, we're talking about some structural elements of the tree. Of course, there's what they call a root flare, which is at the ground level, and you see the swelling where the root shoulders come up to the trunk. And you have a trunk. This is the vertical element. Usually one, there are exceptions, either trees that for some reason were stubbed back. Figs are a little different sometimes, but usually one central trunk. And then the main branches that form the skeletal structure of the tree itself are called scaffold branches. Typically, we're thinning down to 3 or 4, maybe 5 scaffold branches that form the arms of the trunk that everything else develops on. Then everything else out off of those scaffold branches are laterals, and those are where your leaf growth and fruit production is going to happen. So those are the parts of the tree we're talking about when we're looking at pruning these. Okay, so we're talking about making some good cuts, thinning cuts, heading cuts, and talking about the structure of branch collars. Thinning cuts are removal of an entire branch at a parent branch. That can be clear back to the trunk, or that can be pruning a lateral back to the scaffold branch, or pruning a small lateral back to its parent, larger lateral. But you're actually removing the whole branch back at its junction. From that point, what normally happens when you remove a branch like that, then the buds that were past it on the parent branch get more energy and are more likely to develop a little bit more aggressively. A heading cut is when you stub a branch, and you want to stub a branch just past a viable bud. And you want to position that bud carefully because you're stopping the energy flow that was going out here. And now all that energy that's coming up that nice big branch is now focused into one or two little buds here. And so the first couple of buds back from the cut are going to produce a tremendous amount of growth because they're getting all the energy out of that branch.
How you tell like the growth plate from a fruit bud?
Yeah, so the difference between, we'll hit that in just a minute here when we look at some branches. The difference between a flower bud and a vegetative growth bud, a leaf or stem bud. There's some variability there, but generally speaking, flower buds will be larger, more rounded, and leaf buds and vegetative buds will typically be pressed closer to the stem, smaller and more pointed. There's some variation from tree to tree. That's just some good generalizations for what you're looking for. So the branch collar, this is a good sample. You got a parent branch here. You got a secondary branch coming off it. This special area of differentiated tissue where those two join, the shoulder of this branch, is what they call a branch collar. It's really important that you leave that branch collar intact when you're removing branches, when you're thinning, because that will heal over really, really fast. But if you cut into it to try to make it flush to the actual parent branch, you've got a much larger wound and it doesn't have the right type of tissues to rapidly seal that wound. And you can see it from the folks at home, you can see the parent branch structure, the second branch, and this swollen tissue right here is the branch collar where the two branches join. So when we're looking at that, a good example. Now, sorry, I have very few fruit trees on site this time of year. We're working with a flowering cherry at the moment here. We're looking at the tree and we know we're going to have some branches that are crossing, that are in the way, definitely a problem, remove those. So when you're making a cut, there's just the branch collar right here, put our hook to, put a blade to, and we're cutting flush to the branch collar like that is an appropriate thinning cut. You can see the same thing in the images online. It's a thinning cut. Heading branches back. Do a couple of things. First of all, they're taking a lot of secondary tissues you don't necessarily need for fruit production or for the current season's fruit production. They're limiting the weight expanse on the outer edges of the branches, and you're directing the tree's growth in specific directions. Use a birch branch to substitute for an apple branch in this case. So heading cuts are made something approximately in the vicinity of a 1/4 inch past the viable bud you want to keep. Too much stub will just die back. Too little stub and what dieback you get may encapsulate back behind the bud itself and damage the bud. You want to make your cut at a slant that kind of is where the back edge is your 1/4 inch and you're then slanting away. And ooh, I need to adjust these pruners, don't I? That's what I get for grabbing them off my shelf without attending to them. So you should be sharp enough and adjust enough you don't tear. But you want to get that angle of cut so that your back edge is still that 1/4 inch past the bud, but on the opposite side of the bud. Allow for dieback. Now, what will happen here is this bud is going to develop, and this branch is going to go this way. So we're encouraging that development as well as removing a certain amount of tissues off the end. Pruning too close is really a problem, and it's one of the most common mistakes people made. Flat cuts tend to not heal quite as quickly or as cleanly, and you never know exactly how far back you're going to heal. So a nice little 45-degree angle approximately cut is ideal. Saw cutting is a little bit different. By the time you're moving up to things that you're cutting with a saw, you've got a lot of weight out here. And if you just simply cut down where you want to make the cut, you're going to get about 3/4, 7/8 through. That branch is going to snap, and that tissue that's still attached on the bottom is just going to tear. You're going to just tear out a whole strip of bark back further than you wanted to make that cut. So you definitely want to make an undercut, which is where you want your finished cut to be, or at least approximately. And then you can make that cut 1/3 to 1/4. You don't want to get so far up on your undercut that you pinch your blade as that weight comes down. So be judicious, but you want to make sure you're clearing a lot of that attached tissues. And then you want to move out several inches to 6 inches on a big branch maybe, and then make your down cut, vertical down cut. And again, when you get so far down, there's enough weight out there that's going to crack and snap. And now it's going to snap back to where you made that undercut, which is going to break off there, leaving you just a little stub with no weight on it. But then you can go through and follow up with your cut down to make your clean cut. A really big branch, you might actually want to do some branch removal out here first, and then come in and do your final cut. This happens a lot when you're restoring an old tree, because there's so much weight. You just really can't manage it any other way. Plus, the dropping large amounts of branch through other branches is not a good idea if you can avoid it. But we're trying to avoid as much of the tearing and splitting as possible when making a saw cut. And it's really hard to get a good clean saw cut at a branch collar. You can do it and try to do the best you can, but most of the time our saw cutting is on bigger, more lateral directing branches. So, decisions on pruning. What are we looking for? Well, first thing we're looking for, dead or damaged tissue. Get up in your tree, investigate it from all sides, get up in it, remove any obviously dead branches. You can see in the picture here, left-hand picture, you got actually a dead spur branch on that peach tree, and then the live viable branch down below it. Damaged tissues. You can see I've got a rub mark or some other physiological injury on that. I think that's still my peach in that middle picture. It doesn't look like a canker. I think that's a rub from an older branch that got removed later. Damaged tissues like that are subject to infection and restrict flow through the branch. They should be pruned out as much as is practical and possible. And then that right-hand picture is the imminent difficulty of peaches and other stone fruits, fungal and bacterial diseases. And you can see the ooze coming out of that branch collar. That branch is infected with a disease. That branch needs to go. Even if it looks okay out here on the end, that's infected as a canker down there. So we need to prune it out at the branch collar as cleanly as possible, and then disinfect the pruners, because we know we just cut right through diseased tissue at that point. So those are the things you're looking for. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. In our flowering cherry sample here, we got, see these nice branches, all these nice brown, kind of reddish brown, swollen buds. What happened here? Don't know what happened, but this branch is dead. There's no bud development. There's no tip bud development. There's no viability of that branch. That's a branch that needs to be removed. So that's your first step. Then pause, evaluate. Now what have you got left? Now we want to look at, oops, too far today. Crossing and rubbing branches, critical structural elements. So we got a tree growing up, and you've pruned it and it's put on new growth. Well, sometimes that new growth goes where you want it. And sometimes it sees there's light over here and it does this across the center of the tree, or it goes up and interferes with the level of branches above it. So it's very important that we eliminate, first of all, anything that's touching where the branches are rubbing together. That's just going to create an injury spot. It's not viable for any keeping. Decide which branch is more important to keep, remove the offender. But also branches that are crossing across the center are giving you fits. Sometimes rejuvenating an old orchard, I've had to keep some, at least for several years, until I could develop more scaffold. But generally speaking, you don't want a branch to start over here and end up over there. Structurally not sound. Also blocks light. So branches that cross the center or are rubbing together or interfering with each other. That's your next priority. Your third priority then is to shape. So we're talking about developing an open, spreading crown that's easy to manage. I like to use the donut analogy. If you have a fruit tree and you stand and you put your toes up against the trunk and you look up, you should see sky, not branches, open centered with all your live branches kind of around the perimeter. Okay. And there's a variety of pruning styles. There are other ways you can manage a fruit tree. That's an easy one, though, for most homeowners to manage, the true open center. So, open center, far right picture. That's what we typically are going for. Minimal or no branches in the center, everything spread out laterally. You can do a modified leader. It's real common on a young tree to modify a leader before you finish opening out the center. Some trees actually handle that better than truly opening out. It's really hard to get a really good open-centered pear tree. They just don't do it. They really are very vertical. Central leader is usually done for trees for orchards where you're doing a much larger tree, semi-dwarf or full-size trees. It can be beneficial and it's good practice for nut trees as well, as they're a little different. We'll talk about them at the end a little bit. Generally speaking, for homeowners, a central leader tree is hard to maintain. It's too big, and it's hard to get a good distribution of branches on. Certainly a possible viable style, but we generally don't recommend it. So you can see what that looks like in a really, really, really old production apple tree. And this, you see in the left-hand picture, it had been neglected for probably, looking at the growth spurts, probably about 2 or 3 years. It didn't get pruned, came back through for rejuvenation pruning. And you see what we got left with after. But that's still production tree. Now, it was a light production that year, although it picked up after that. But that's the idea of an open-centered shape. This is what you're actually aiming for overall. And one of the things you want to watch on a tree is the lateral growth intervals. And then are they going lateral or are they water sprouting? Are they going vertical, right? So you can tell a lot about a tree's overall health and vigor by how much lateral growth it's putting on at the ends of its scaffold branches every year. And for most fruit trees, there's some various numbers that get thrown around a lot out there, but if you're getting 12 to 15 to maybe 18 inches of new growth on your laterals, that's a good, healthy amount of growth to keep, right? That's as far as to be seeing on a tree. It means you're not over-fertilizing, you're not under-fertilizing, you're not over-pruning, you're not under-pruning. You've got a healthy, vigorous tree. Much more than 18 to 24 inches, you're either over-pruning or overfeeding, most likely. Young trees do that, though. Be aware that there's some differences with age. Much less than 12 inches, your tree is not performing well. It may need to be pruned to rejuvenate, pruned harder to encourage more pushing of growth, or fed more, because you're down to a point where you're not going to have a lot of fruit production because there's not the right ages of wood there. Okay, so we'll take a step back and look at a very young tree. So this would be a typical like 2-year-old bare root tree, 2-year-old graft. And what you want to do on a young tree is, first of all, look at those lowest branches when it's in the ground. Because where those branches start is never going to be any higher than it is right now. If those branches are 15 inches off the ground, that's where those branches will start. That's probably too low for you to maintain. So priority, first of all, is to start limbing up any low branches up to the level where you really want to start your scaffold branches developing. There's lots of options on where that is. 18 inches is acceptable. I usually go for about 30 for starting my fruit trees. I like something that's got a little more height. But get those low branches out of the way before they become too big to prune easily. Next thing, of course, we look for any obviously broken branches, any branches that, again, have crossing problems. Branch angles matter. So if you've got a young tree you're trying to develop and you've got branches that are in a real tight emergence angle, you need to either remove those branches or stretch them, put spacers in to get more angle. What happens on a branch collar is that if you look at a branch collar, it's basically at 90 degrees. It has a very little branch collar, but also doesn't have a lot of structural rigidity because everything goes down from there. If you look at a branch that is really tight to the trunk, it's got a very elongated branch collar. Now, branch collar is nice tissue in terms of healing from injury, but it's not structurally as sound as the parent wood underneath it. Really long branch collars are likely to get damaged from ice storms or snow load and just break off again and tear. So we want something in the middle. I mean, 45 degrees is great, but you don't need to be getting out there with your measuring your angles. Just not something super tight and not 90 degrees. You want some of these acute angles in there for your branch emergence. So on a young tree, you definitely want to select for that right at the outset so you don't have a problem later that's really hard to fix. Especially, I worry much more about branches that are too tight than are too wide. Too wide, you can fix them later. They're too tight, they're sitting there competing for nutrients and energy, and they're both swelling. And you get to a point where removing one of them gets very difficult. So do it while they're young. Past that, we look at little interior stuff, making sure you're not leaving a lot of little wispy branches or stub branches in the interior, because at a young planting age tree, you're not really expecting fruit this first year. And then we might head back some of the weaker branches, both to control the direction of the branch development. So they are pushing one way or the other from the parent branch angle, or to simply thicken them up. Really wispy branches will get like this really fast, but if you stub them, they'll actually thicken up and the next emerging growth will come out bigger. We are trying to create ultimately a scaffold branch structure that is somewhat symmetrical around the tree. So branches we are selecting to keep on a young tree, this applies to the first basically 3 to 4 years of development typically. You want to select branches that are good, healthy branches at good angles, that are spaced around the tree, and they're not coming out from the same vertical level for the same issues of strength. You have two big branches, scaffold branches, at the same level on the trunk. Those branch collars will actually run together around the tree. And now you've got a split potential where the whole tree can split under weight load for heavy fruit or freeze damage. So staggered heights, spaced around, and 3 to 4 to 5 scaffold branches is typically what we're trying to get. Kind of a fun quote that Christian Art always likes to share. The customer says, "You cut half my tree." And Ronaldo, the tree butcher, says, "No, I only cut a third." A third is a heavy pruning on a fruit tree. It's a good measure of safe level. You get much beyond a third of branch removal on a tree. You're putting some serious stress on that tree, but you can get up to that volume pretty safe. Yes?
Straight up.
We're going to let one go straight up because we haven't finished selecting our scaffold branches yet, and we want more options at more levels. Okay. Now that does vary. I mean, if you got a tree that comes in really high limbed in the first place, you might not do that. Typically, what we'll do is as you see here, my trees at home, I always top that leader, but just a bit to encourage some of these intermediate buds between the top and the next lateral down to start pushing out, so you have some options to select. But normally, you don't necessarily want to just shorten them right up front. Now, there are options and exceptions. A peach tree, nectarines, apricots actually do really well if you top that hard and start your branching low. We recommend that. I didn't do that on my peach tree and I regret it. Because you actually want a low scaffold on them for accessibility, the way the fruit ripens and checking for ripeness. It's really hard to do on a tree that's a higher open-centered tree. And they can certainly be topped harder as long as, again, you're not taking off more than roughly a third of the branch volume. Typically, apples and pears, you want to work towards this, keeping a leader until you finish selecting your scaffold branches, and then you'll take the center out. So as that tree progresses, you can see the consistent developing to a shape, developing the scaffold branches, thinning out some of the clutter, where you get lots and lots of branches and you only need a few of them. By year 4, you're into significant production on most fruit trees, and you're beginning to develop the open center. And that's about the point usually when we start thinking about actually taking out the leader entirely and developing the full open center. It's somewhere year 3 or year 4, depending on how those scaffolds develop. So here's a couple of examples in photographics. So this was it's a 4-year-old plum tree, had been pruned consistently the first obviously the first 2 years as the grower, and first year in the ground. So this is the second full year in the ground, 4-year-old tree. Lots of branches, real typical of plum. They fill in the center horribly with lots of crossing branches. And so then you look at the right-hand picture, that's a thoroughly pruned 4-year-old plum tree ready to actually start its first year of production. This is my 4-year-old peach tree at home. I told you I didn't chop it down as hard as I should have, and now I'm on a ladder doing all that pruning work instead. You see how much that fills in those interior spaces, and that's just not good. You want light penetration in for good fruit production and to encourage airflow to reduce disease problems. So by the point we're at this, I've got this down. You can see in the right-hand picture, I've got basically 4 scaffold branches. They're a little close together for my taste, but you do with what you got. And we've opened out the center, and we've also thinned the laterals. Okay, so opening out the center is one thing. All the little wispy stuff in the center is not doing you much good anyway. It's just blocking light. But when you get something like this on a lateral, now what? Okay, so it's all clean to this point. Well, looking at something like this, we know that the stuff back here, unless you've got some good flower and fruit spurs and it's got a good angle, you might want to keep a couple of these back in here for fruit production. On a young branch like this, I might not bother. We get that one out right away. The real problem is out here. These are too congested. They don't allow space for the fruit to develop, and they don't allow space for good air circulation. So we need to selectively remove a few of these. And the obvious candidates are the ones that are going to give us the most problem. That can just come out. Now we've got a really nice flower bud right there. So we're going to keep that stub and bud to have a fruit this year. Next year, we'll likely take that off, but it depends a little bit on what we get for secondary growth after there. Okay, up here is a little less determinate. Okay, so this is viable. This is viable. This is kind of conflicting with both of those. We'll go ahead and thin it all the way back. Open that out. Still a little bit much here. We will take that one out entirely and that one out entirely. And now you don't need all of this leaf bud production out here on the end. So let's stub it and direct it outward pointing buds and shortened. And that's a well-spaced lateral branch for fruit production and continuing growth the next year. So again, old open-centered apple tree here. I really prefer this style. Even semi-dwarf trees can be maintained to an open center, although it's easier on dwarf trees. It brings your mature tree height down to maybe 12 to maybe 15 feet. It can be as short as 10 feet if it's done well. So that's short ladder work and quite manageable for most people. And you can see again how we've really opened out the center, the donut effect. So what happens on an older tree as it develops out? Okay, so the older branches, you're in good fruit production, nice lateral development. Maybe you're starting to see a reduction in growth, or maybe a reduction in flower development, whether you've noticed the actual length of growth in the laterals or not. Well, branches do age, and periodically they need to be headed back and regrown. This happened actually several times on this tree, and you can see some of the pruning scars from some of the older heading backs and a new branch going up and out and redeveloping the lateral growth from that scaffold. That's a perfectly sound thing. We prefer not to do all of the scaffold branches at once because it obviously it's a huge crimp in your fruit production that year. But if you do that much branch removal in one year, you're going to have a ton of new growth out that you're going to have to deal with. So rejuvenation pruning on old trees is very important. Usually starts getting into that 20 and 30-year-old trees. We're not talking about real young trees at that point. All the vertical growth that comes out every year on these fruit trees is what we call water sprouting. Doesn't set a lot of flower buds on it at all, and it will eventually develop more laterals that can then become productive tissue. But mostly it's just blocking light and air circulation. So it's real typical to spend the first big chunk of your pruning time out there once you've taken care of large structural issues, disease issues, damaged branches, just taking out all the water sprouts, taking out all that stuff that grows up all the way back to their parent branch. If you keep on top of it year after year, it's manageable. If you let it go 3 or 4 years, not so manageable. That's quite a chore to take that much water sprouting out with branches that are pushing an inch and a half on where they join into the parent branch. So regular pruning is better than letting it go and then fixing it.
So are you doing, which cuts are you doing? Are you taking those
Those
all
are
the way down?
those
to
are
the
thinning
top,
cuts, and those are generally thinning cuts. You're removing them all the way back to the parent branch.
Okay.
Now, after you've done some branch rejuvenation, getting an older tree, and you may decide, well, I could take this a little bigger and maybe create a new layer, or maybe some of these old branches are getting woodpecker holes and cavities, and maybe we need to actually take the whole scaffold branch out and develop a new scaffold. You can keep some stubs on some of the bigger water sprouts and then direct their growth to lateral. You can do that for a couple things. You can replace an old scaffold branch that way from something much further back or from another scaffold branch that's intact and bring it across. But also, if you really want to increase your orchard productivity, you can create the next tier of your donut. So 3 to 4 to 5 scaffold branches out, laterals growing off of that, getting very mature. Maybe keep a couple of water sprouts on the shoulders of the scaffold branches, get them up a bit, and start training them out lateral again. And now you have 2 layers of production wood with some airspace between them, but still all in a ring on the outside. And it won't be this perfectly symmetrical thing, that's fine. But creating those layers increases your possible productivity on a tree that is vigorous enough to support it. Obviously, on very small dwarf trees, they may not layer out that well. A lot of semi-dwarf stuff is real common to develop another layer of fruiting branches above the lower branches. Now, these rules are well and good, but there are definitely exceptions. Nut trees are different. Yes, filberts and chestnuts are often pruned to what looks like a trunk scaffold lateral development, but no matter how much they kind of look like that, they really kind of aren't. They're more actually like a walnut, though they don't look like it. So what walnuts are probably the classic example of this. Rather than having a scaffold branch structure, you have a trunk, and then you have the trunk bifurcates, and you have competing ascending heads, not shared lateral scaffold branches. So it will look somewhat similar. You'll keep 3 or 4 maybe good heads going, but each of those heads needs to be hard pruned and rejuvenation pruned every few years, or it simply stops producing. So they need the rejuvenation pruning. So what happens usually on a walnut is you'll top them out every 3 or 4 years and make them regrow ascending heads, and you'll have a year with no production. Normal walnut production here commercially is not a big thing anyway, but it's a little harder to manage on a big tree, and walnuts are usually big trees. Hazelnuts and chestnuts, the branches will look more like scaffold branches, but they are still ascending heads. They still age out. There are 2 major schools of thought in production of chestnuts and hazelnuts. And one is to prune them like a fruit tree, to spreading lateral branches, and then either head back all those scaffold branches, giving you a year with no production, and the next 2 years are extremely heavy, or manage it more intensively and carefully and take a branch, head it back. Next year, you take this branch and head it back on basically a 3 to 4 year rotary cycle going around each tree. Hard to maintain on an orchard for a homeowner. That's not so bad. Both approaches work, but you have to do that hard in rejuvenation pruning, forcing the regrowth, or they simply lose their vigor and ability to produce crop. So rejuvenation pruning.
How about for figs?
Figs are funny. Okay, so basically the only figs you're going to grow successfully here are Breba type figs, where you get the fruit is set up ahead and then it ripens on the early summer crop. Occasionally we'll ripen the second crop on Breba figs, the new growth crop. But our summers are not really long and hot enough for consistent production on the second crop figs or those late crop figs. So figs, easiest way to grow figs is actually to grow them as a multi-trunk large bush, a mallee structure, something like that. So don't grow them to a single trunk at all. They're not grafted. Suckers coming up from the ground level are the same variety as the top, but encourage a multi-trunk structure. Open out the center aggressively, so you have a very clean open center with only an occasional branch coming vertically into it, not crossing over. But you need to thin so they put out lots and lots of growth. You need to thin a significant percentage of that new growth back. That percentage varies depending on what you're actually seeing in the tree. But you need to reduce the amount of 1-year-old growth, the last summer's growth, to a tolerable level. It's typically running around 30 to 50% removal of the previous season's growth. But you need to look at all that growth for the juvenile Breba figs that have already set last fall that are going to ripen in the early summer, so you're not taking out too many of your Brebas and eliminating your whole crop. There are some excellent videos online. Clackamas Master Gardeners put together a great video on fig pruning where they're actually pruning a very big fig in the ground. It might be worth your looking at too. Persimmons, your Asian persimmons, American persimmons are a little different. Asian persimmons flower and fruit on their newer growth. So typical is to, again, develop a basic overall branch structure, scaffold structure, but then doing some heading back, either half the branches or all the branches to encourage a vigorous new growth spurt that will produce the flower and fruit. Congruent with that, though, you need to keep them from cluttering. And the problem with that constant heading back on persimmons is they spend all kinds of growth going all kinds of different ways that you then have to get in and again. But you can't just feather them out like you do an apple tree because they're not producing on the wood back here. They're producing right as the new growth emerges. Some other specialty stuff to discuss. Multi-variety combo trees are great when you don't have a lot of space. However, you do have to be careful because you can't see it when you're doing the pruning, what variety is what, and if you make the wrong cuts, you can completely eliminate a variety from your tree, and it's surprisingly easy to happen, especially when they're young. My father's orchard there, and his technique is multicolored irrigation flagging, because irrigation is what he did. And he has lots of it floating around. And so he just labeled the branches redly while they were in fruit the previous year, what's what. So he could follow and trace what branches go to what variety and when he's pruning in the winter. Then you take those off so they don't strangle as the new growth swells up the next year. You'll also note that multi-variety trees have a strong tendency to have one variety that is super, super vigorous and one or two varieties that are just really puny. And finding that balance point, not only in terms of overall branch percentage, but even positionally and laterally on the tree can be challenging for that reason. So they do require a little extra attention to the pruning, though the basic rules of pruning still apply. Espaliers are a little different. So you got a tree that is trained out on wires, and when you're doing espalier, you're no longer doing a once a year pruning. You're doing your primary pruning light in the winter. You don't want to over prune in your dormant season. And then as the new growth emerges through the summer, you're doing a constant, like every other week, heading back some branches that are getting too long, opening out some vegetative branches that are closing over. So you've got this maintenance pruning that goes on several times over the summer to make sure you're maintaining basically these cylindrical zones of fruit, leaf, and flower growth on each wire. So again, a little more attention, but also spread out over time. You just can't chop them as hard up front and let them be, or all you get is all this cluttered growth that just ruins the form and is non-productive. So we get a lot of questions about this in these pruning sessions. Okay, I bought a house. There's fruit trees on it. Nobody's touched them for years. Now what? First thing is to look at them and evaluate them very, very carefully. Trees that old grow hollow. It's real common for them to be a hollow center with a ring of live tissue around the outside edge. It's just totally common. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is signaling an aging factor, and it's also a risk factor for developing rots in the interior. You really need to evaluate if this tree is, first of all, salvageable. Yes, fruit trees can produce for 100 or 150 years, theoretically. But if a tree has not been maintained and it's got health problems, you're far ahead to take it out now rather than spending 3 or 4 years trying to rehab it and then giving up and planting a new tree. It takes basically 3 years to get a new fruit tree into some degree of production, even if it's not as heavy as an old ancient tree. So bear that in mind. It may not be worth the salvaged. Look at disease issues, look at structural issues. Is it leaning? It's not a good sign. You can maybe correct some of that, but you may not be able to. You're going to be fighting that the whole rest of its lifespan. Once you've decided, yes, I'm going to salvage this tree. So you need to get up in there and you need to remove every dead, broken, damaged stem out of that canopy. That may be your entire first year of pruning if it's been really neglected for a long period of time. You got a lot of stuff in there that is just not good. Also, at that point, you want to go through and remove any basal sucker growth and see what you can do about water spreads, but try to keep yourself in bounds. You don't want to remove more than, I say, about 25 or 30% of the total available leaf mass of that tree, or it's not going to respond well to the pruning. Once you've got the damage under control, now you're going to start looking at the upper canopy. How are we going to open out all of this clutter across and allow light on into those lower branches and into the center? So this may involve removing 1 or 2 very large branches out of the center and getting them out. Best done during the dormant season because you're going to have a heck of a time getting those out when they're in leaf. This may instead involve heavy thinning of multiple smaller branches. At that point, also look at any of the new growth that's coming in the central areas, especially, but also a little bit out on the lateral lines, and look at the weak stuff. Either it's really spindly, or it's a branch that its lateral growth, its secondary lateral growth, is very, very short. Those are branches that are weak. Those are things that would be considered candidates for removal. Again, keeping it around 25-ish%, maybe 30% of the total available leaf mass. By this point in time, you're getting back into production. Now you're starting to really open out the center of that tree. This is, again, a point where you might start looking at some of that low scaffold and decide, maybe I need to head back one of these low scaffolds and start developing that layer up, that next refreshed growth. Maybe you've got some, last time I did an old apple tree, I had some branches that were growing like that, almost a complete serpentine. They just had to come out. Second year for me, third year, depending on how much pruning you were doing the years before. Take them out entirely. Even if they're 4 inches around, they're not going to be sustainable growth long term. And then maintenance from there. Make sure you've got your height under control. Figure out how many gapped layers of production branches you can do, usually 2 or 3, and develop them out. And then just continually maintain them, removing all those vertical water sprouts as they come up. And there'll be a lot when you're rehabbing an old tree. So say you've got a really, really neglected old tree, but you just can't bring yourself to take it out. Consider pollarding. It's not the recommended pruning technique for fruit trees, but if you've got something that is just unmanageable to even start with, get out the chainsaw and take it down to 4 to 5 scaffold branches stubbed with a couple of 4 feet of length on them and let it regrow. You're going to fight it for 3 years, but you can save it or it will die. I mean, pollarding can't kill them. But sometimes that's the decision you have to make that manageable. So a couple of things I just wanted to go over here as we finish up. Tool selections. And you can see some samples over there on the table. So loppers come in a variety of sizes. And really the upper end of lopper size pruning is maybe 1.5 to 1 3/4 inches, because there's a certain amount of force involved and you can only generate so much. Loppers give you reach and jaw span for doing that kind of work. Some loppers are fully adjustable, or you can actually extend them out like an extension saw. More reach. When you are shopping for loppers, look for loppers that have some sort of a ratchet or gearing assembly on them. Old style straight bypass loppers were fine, but they take a tremendous amount of functional force to use, which is really hard on your wrists and elbows. They often get out of true because you're putting so much force down, you're torquing as you go, so they get kind of bent up and they no longer make clean cuts. These various hook assemblies or sprocket assemblies really do make a much easier prune. I've got a pair of loppers I would take through a broom handle, they just go, and it's very nice. Hand pruners are really designed for something to maybe 3/4 inch max. It can be really hard on your hands. I'm having quite a few hand problems at my age with this and typing and artwork and everything else. It's really hard. There are some tools that make that easier. Ratchet hand pruners. They don't make the cut all at once. They go in segments, and they take a ton of the stress off your handwork. If I was doing that with my hand pruners, I would be starting up about here, not down that far and that big of a step, because the stress on the fingers is too much. Saws, there's lots of options for saws. I prefer a stiff-bladed short saw over these long-bladed flimsy saws because I inevitably get my saw blade on those flimsy saws stuck in my branch. You have less problem with those, even though they take a slightly larger swath to cut out. You do have to be a little more careful with them, though. They're brittle. You can break a blade easier on them, where a flexy, curvy blade bends, and you may be able to straighten it out enough to use again. If you put that much torque on one of those rigid cut blades, it will just snap, and you'll have to replace the blade. Giraffe pruners, you can see one against the wall there, are simply a small hand pruner, but on a pole. Some of them have a fixed length, others, again, are adjustable. They enable you to do some of this fine working without moving your ladder 10 times. You can't prune quite as large a material on a giraffe as you can with your standard hand pruner because it just doesn't transfer the force as well. With the really extending forms, when you got like a 6-foot giraffe, gets kind of heavy in the shoulders over time. Not as bad as a pole saw, but it's definitely a noticeable amount of stress and strain. Pruning sealants and wound coatings. Don't use them unless you have an absolutely compelling need to. Trees heal from pruning much faster and much cleaner without any sort of wound dressing. So why do we carry wound dressings? Treat injuries, off-season pruning due to a branch break, something like that. So larger injuries that are not a clean pruning cut can be sealed to prevent infection and to reduce insect damage. Trees that for any reason you're pruning off season that are bleeding, you might consider pruning just to keep the sap flow in. Consider sealing just to keep the sap flow in. Generally still, we recommend not. Trees heal better without sealant. So that's Pruning 101. I would welcome any questions from any of the folks here or any of the folks